Good afternoon, everybody. Thanks for joining the webinar, and also special thanks to all distinguished panelists. So in the beginning, we will start with what is INHAF and what is this webinar series. So I will request Banishri Madam, who is the Governing Council member of INHAF, to dwell a little bit upon what INHAF and this initiative of reshaping the city or reimagining city by the INHAF. Madam, you have to on your audio. Banish, madam. Yeah, now. Okay? Yes, please go ahead.
Okay. Namaskar. I join Dr. Ravikant Joshi in welcoming panelists and participants to this webinar, which is fourth in the series of 30 webinars that have been organized. And before we proceed with today's discussions, I will take a few minutes to introduce the series. From June to September this year, something like 100 people will discuss and share perspectives on a number of issues under the theme of Rethinking Indian Cities. Many others will join as participants and enrich the process with questions, comments, food for thought. So the platform is intended to be shared by experts, specialists, planners, economists, development thinkers, young professionals, activists, and anybody who has anything to do with cities. Some of you may have attended the earlier 3 webinars, 2 of which were reflections on the idea and practice of people-centric cities. And the third was about the implications of the COVID-19 pandemic on cities. These have already generated a lot of interest and participation. The next one on 6th July will be on the question, is city-led economic growth under stress? This is a very relevant question, of course, when economies of cities, which produce 60% of our GDP, have been decimated by the pandemic. So what is this webinar series about? The logic behind 30 or even more webinars is to be able to adequately handle the complexity of the subject, which is rethinking Indian cities. 1 or 2 would leave much unsaid and unaddressed, and many questions unasked. The series is the joint effort of INHAF and a number of urban professionals, academic institutions, and civil society organizations who are engaged in the field of human settlements for a very long time. For undertaking this whole series of 30 webinars, a studio INHAF has been set up especially to coordinate the series, while each webinar is anchored by any of the partners. Like this one is by Dr. Ravikant Joshi. The focus is on Indian cities, but that does not mean that the webinars are restricted to Indian speakers and participants and Indian situations only. The events have a mix of people and experiences from India and elsewhere across the world. This enriches the process of reflection and learning for us and how we should look at rethinking the Indian city. The webinars are seen as opening the much needed societal dialogue on how we handle urbanization processes and develop cities so that they remain engines of economic growth, but minus the exploitative instinct which big cities have and the exploitative elements and systems. The need for this is not new, but as we know, the inconsistencies, divides, and even fragility of local economic, social, and governance processes have intensified manifold now under this testing health emergency. Of course, many initiatives and policies are there already. Perhaps we need to connect the disconnected, and that is where societal dialogue can be of help. The reason for selecting this time is also to grab the opportunity to engage on a virtual platform. People are in a reflective frame of mind, even if temporarily, and prepared to invest energy and time in things they would not otherwise have space for in their busy routines. So we exploit that availability of people. Of course, holding webinars is not the end in itself. This webinar series happens to be an integral part of an initiative we have launched last year, coordinated by INHAF. It is called CityUri, Citizens Urban Initiative. CityUri is about a multi-level and multidisciplinary societal effort, which is spearheaded by some of India's leading urban and related professionals, also development thinkers and practitioners. The aim is to work on the country's response to the complex development challenges in a way that ensures productive, inclusive, sustainable, and livable cities, towns, as well as villages. The webinars will provide directions and takeaways to move along this path. Finally, I urge all of you to visit the website of INHAF for announcements and links to webinars and other initiatives of INHAF. So with that, I hand over to Dr. Ravikant Joshi to take forward today's proceedings. Thank you.
Thank you, Banashri. I would invite first Mr. Kunal Kumar, Joint Secretary, who because of very urgent another commitment has to go, but nonetheless he agreed to provide his perspective in the beginning, and then also he will, if possible, come back to get the views or to get the view of what has happened. So Mr. Kunal Kumar is Joint Secretary, as all of you know, of Smart City Missions. And he has also worked earlier as a Municipal Commissioner of Kolhapur and Pune. So welcome, sir. Before I hand over it to you, I just want to ask you two questions to keep in mind while you are presenting your thing. How cities and particularly urban local bodies should improve living conditions for migrant workers and what steps they should take. And more pertinently, referring to you, the cities which have maximum number of migrants fall under the Smart Cities mission. And that is under your jurisdiction. So we would like to hear what you, that means Government of India, is contemplating any midway course correction in the light of the migrant plight in the Smart City Mission guidelines, so that appropriate kind of a project or focus can be taken, because still it is halfway through Smart City Mission. So we would love to listen in the context of your Smart City Mission, what can be the progress. So Mike is all yours and we are eager to hear you.
Thank you, Ravi. Am I audible?
Yes.
Good. Very good evening to all the participants here. As Ravi was saying, in fact, I am a founding member of our International Smart Cities Network, which is meeting at 5:30. So there was a clash, but I wanted to do this. So I have 10 minutes in my hand. I'd like to put forward some points through a presentation and a couple of documents which I'll share. I may stop at 5:20 sharp. So if you can see my screen, Ravi, can you just tell me if the screen is visible?
Yes, it is very well visible.
Fine, thank you. Thank you. So what I'm, the reflection is basically that it's time to reimagine a lot of things and not talk of revival or getting back and normals and new normals that we keep talking about. So these are reflections in those lines, and you've pretty much laid down some points, and I'll try to adhere to them. I see, the broader problem when we talk of the problem of migrants is not the problem of migrants. I think is the problem of the persistence of informality in our society. And I think migrant labor is just a manifestation or a symptom of the problem. So if you see, there are myths. A lot of us feel that people create informality to avoid paying taxes, right? Whereas it is basically the socio-political situation which breeds informality. Informality happens because of weak data and mapping systems. Sometimes we talk about getting remote sensing data to find out where informality is happening, slums are getting developed. It's not about mapping, it's basically about policies, planning, procedures. It's a natural fallout of poverty. No, a level playing field can actually, make it possible for everyone to have the same gains in life. So it's not because of poverty. Informality is criminal. No, informality is not criminal. It's born out of constraints which are faced by people. And you and me, anyone in society facing those constraints will actually get into informal arrangements. Informality is caused because of cost of conducting business. Partly true, but very, more affected by the laws of the land. And that actually increase the cost of the business. And performance on ease of doing business indicators will solve the problem. I think an ecosystem approach is needed. Which is where I just want to say that the larger problem needs to be addressed. It's like in a garden, if you have one tree which is getting rotten or facing some problem, it's not because the one tree has a problem, there's something in the garden which is making that happen. You need to correct that. So while the problem presents itself as a problem of migrant labor, I think it's actually a deeper socioeconomic problem. And any efforts to look at it in isolation would not produce the right results. So migrants, we have to look at in the larger context of what a city is as an economic driver, as an economic place. Just to put in context, all of us know, I don't want to spend time on this slide, the political, governance, economic, and psychological problems faced by people who come to cities. All of us are migrants in some senses. I'm a migrant in Delhi. I may not face all of these problems. I face some of these problems. Some migrants face all of these and more of these problems. So how do we actually structure the debate? I've seen over the last few months, the debate has structured on a social obligation of government or social obligation of society to have equal benefits and societal benefits for everyone. I think that debate, that's absolutely right, but I think that debate doesn't really carry too far because ultimately, while there is an intent, there is also a resource which is needed to offer everything. And so the intention may be right, but the action may not be sufficient, or the resource base may not be sufficient to give it. So I think fundamentally we have to restructure the debate from social obligation-based and rights-based issues to a twofold debate on productivity improvement and dignified lives. So it's a different way of looking at the same thing, which I think will be a win-win for everyone in society, for the industry, for the migrant labor, for the city, for the administration, for everyone, and as a country, you actually benefit. So a dual focus is needed. I think poverty alleviation is one focus where you support informal individual micro entrepreneurs to actually become formal. So that's one part. And then when formality happens, a lot of other things start to come in place. Data gets improved. You come to know about how people are living and how things are happening. And then subsequently, you have to drive towards the economic growth where once formal startups and enterprises have come in, they are enabled to become bigger companies, which you see in the graph below. I've tried to do quickly is you have some bit of self-employed entrepreneurs. In fact, a lot of self-employed entrepreneurs, 99.6% of India's industry comprises of firms of less than 10 workers. And there's a huge set of large companies. When I say huge, there's a substantial chunk of, I think, 23% workforce which works in large companies. And there's absolutely a missing middle in our Indian economy, which is where we are facing all these problems. So how do we create, so you say cities for migrants. Essentially, I look at cities which are, cities which can adapt to the needs of its vibrant economy. So how can we create city planning processes such that they follow the dynamics of the place? Today, I think the place follows the plan, but the plan should follow the place. And you've been in a municipal corporation, Ravi, and you know how planning processes are rigid. So how do we support? Now, it's one thing to criticize and say, ULBs don't do this, ULBs don't do that. By the way, ULBs have been in business for about 28 years now. 92 was the 74th Amendment, and no country has shown such a phenomenal growth in governance power, in such a short period of time. We are evolving and we will evolve. So how do we support as a unit? This is my open invitation to all of us in this webinar as to how do we work together to support ULBs in mapping the dynamic nature of the economies into their planning processes. which includes from data to spatial analysis to participative planning, and also a lot of business process re-engineering. And business process re-engineering is the toughest thing to do because certain institutional mechanisms which are set, power structures actually need to be broken. And that's easier said than done. In most countries, it's happened through revolutions. It's not happened through a devolution on a plate. So that's how it is. So considerations for integrated and dynamic spatial planning. This is just a slide where I can demonstrate IMIT's solution, but we have to remember very consciously that these are not only point solutions that need to come into the system. It's actually going to happen through a bouquet of things where the policy, the infrastructure, the economics, the people, ecology, disaster risk, everything needs to come in place, and then only your planning will become dynamic. Then, about going towards equitable access and equitable access to infrastructure and services. I think a fundamental change in debate needed here is the debate moves around income inequality. We say poverty line is an income line. Say less than $2 a day, some places less than $1.25 a day, less than this or beyond this is middle income, above that is rich. I think the problem fundamentally now needs to be structured in the form of access inequality and not income inequality. So what is access inequality? Traditionally, the best example we have is the mobile phone. Even the richest have a mobile phone, even the poorest have a mobile phone. Can we do the same, let's say, for mobility? The richest have mobility options. Yes, he may or she may have a Mercedes, but I have a good public transport system, which can take me to my place of work, and we both can reach in the same time. So it's access equality towards mobility. And by the way, these are again not social obligations of government. If you start to look at like that, then we're looking at one side of the problem, not the other side. So you have to start to look at how to pay for it also. So, transit-oriented development, land-based financing instruments, land value capture, carbon tax on private vehicles, so things like that have to come into the picture now. We have to start to look at new ways of financing access equality. Once the debate is structured properly, we move towards it. Then the similar thing will go for housing for all. And housing for all in the traditional way of government providing is one way to look at it. But you see, rental housing, the way it is panning out across the globe, it's actually being driven by the market and driven in a way that's actually more competitive than what government does. And I'm not saying that government has to come out of it. I'm just saying there are multiple different options that need to be explored. And how you can play around with, FSI or, vacant land tax and things like that. How can you ring fence property tax to do this? These are innovativeness, which actually will not come through traditional ways of doing things. Then water and sanitation for all. No business saying that water and sanitation should be of one type in one place, another type in one place. It's equitable access equality for water and sanitation. Then health for all. Similarly, as far as health is concerned. So how do you create robust primary health infrastructure by either leveraging technology or otherwise, and you increase access to health. There's a very nice book which Mr. Chandrasekhar from TCS has written. It's called Digital Nation, and it talks about how you can use technology in the Indian context. A lot of debate happens around AI and machine learning, around what it will do to jobs and what it will not do to jobs. But by the way, every country and every society needs to have its collective consciousness in place as to what it wants from technology. Does it want to augment humans? Does it want to replace humans? Or what kind of use of technology do you want? I think health is a classical case, and we've seen it in the recent times, of how we could have actually used technology to actually create a lot of jobs. Say a ASHA worker going with a tablet to a hamlet and actually being able to talk to the best doctor in the land because it is connected through telemedicine. So things like that is possible if you reorient our thinking. Then similarly, education for all. We've seen a clear divide in society during these times when some people have been able to access education while others have completely gone blank because they do not have any access to education. So can you use television? Can you use different modes of reaching out education to everyone? I mean, it's very, very important because I think one, there is a challenge because you already a low income household, so you're facing a lot of challenges. Second, if you can't get good education, you're not preparing yourself for the knowledge economy of the future. And there are ways to do it. And as a smart cities mission, if you ask, I'm not trying to say that, well, this should be done. We're actually trying to implement these. These are things that are getting implemented in bits and pieces in places we're trying to scale up. It doesn't happen overnight. As I said, the urban local bodies, they work through a lot of constraints. But these are ideas that are coming by the way from them. So these are things which I would like to work together with the group which is there on this webinar. And of course, how do you look at universal coverage and public provisions through all the infrastructure that you build, the India Stack, the Jam Trinity, the networks, and all that we talked about. So all this will only happen when we move to a decentralized way of functioning, where cities and communities are getting more and more empowered. Again, easier said than done. Please believe me, because I would want to say that decentralized. It's easy to sit across a table in an AC chamber and say decentralized. But it doesn't happen like that. It's fundamental restructuring of power. And it takes time, it takes patience, it takes hard work. And I think people should have the patience and constructive approach to actually make this happen over time. So, but it has to happen with accountability and appropriate incentives. For all this to happen, this probably is a foundational thing. So I'll end the presentation here quickly. Two documents: reorient, reimagine, restart. Let me just. So this is another thing. Can you see my screen, Ravi?
Yes.
So this is one thing I want to evolve, and I would invite people who are on this call to actually work with us. It's a market-based solution that they're thinking of.
No, second one is not up.
Oh, okay. Wait.
Blue one is not up.
So I have to stop this
and then.
Okay, so now you can see it?
Yes.
So this is another work in progress, Ravi. This is not a final document. What we're saying is there are multiple acts which the state governs. Like, for example, the BOCW Act, the Factory Workers Act, the Interstate Migrants Act.
Correct.
And so all of them, can you create something in a city where everything converges instead from the state to the city? You have kind of a city labor trust. This is a name, again, don't pin me to it because this is a work in progress. Otherwise, tomorrow, somebody asks me, what were you doing, talking of things which don't exist. But fundamentally, if you see, it's a one-stop solution for these kind of functions. So enumeration, data, facilitation, complaint redressal, information sharing, and all that. So essentially what you're saying is what the state does today happens at the city level. And these are, by the way, bodies which are represented by the civic society of the city, industry, as well as the municipal corporations. And actually, how they go about, survey and city level services and registration of workers and things like that. And we've seen the flow of how it works today in the Building and Construction Worker Act and the Factory Workers Act and all that. And we're trying to say existing fund flow is like this, the proposed fund flow is like this, how it should move forward. So essentially how a BOCW kind of thing can exist, in a decentralized manner. That's one thing I wanted to share. So I'll stop this sharing and then I'll probably come back to the last document I want to share, which is, can you see the market-based?
Yes, it is visible.
So this is again, a very colloquial way of saying this will be an OEO for social rental housing. And for all the, talk, Government of India has actually come out and said, done affordable housing rental complexes, and we've done a Swanidhi scheme for street vendors, and so many other things are happening. And I'm saying, just look at what markets can do, what is the current, what are the possible solutions, and can these aggregators who provide rental housing, hoteling, and things like that can actually come in? And, so we've had a lot of dialogue with the private sector partners also, and this is another work in progress. We're trying to build what is called a green label housing. A housing with basic amenities like good sanitation, water, linkage to education and everything. It's actually given, like an OU is a label which gives you a guaranteed XYZ in a hotel room. A green label social rental housing gives you an XYZ guaranteed facilities and here the local governments and these aggregators can actually come together along with the employers and come and provide a solution like this. So these are two works which are in progress right now, which we are building up. So I will probably stop here. Of course, you can see that these are reimagination. This kind of talk we were not doing in the past. And it's also going to happen through constructing engagement between a lot of stakeholders. Okay. Pointing fingers that this did not happen and that did not happen is not going to work. I think all of us have to work together to make this happen. So it's an open invitation. You have my email ID. If anybody who's interested in working on these platforms with us. We're very happy to engage. We're working with some cities also, excellent ideas coming forward. I think we're moving on the right track. I think the intent is there, clearly the resources crunch and the approach we're trying to solve. And hopefully we'll get there. Thank you for this webinar. It's a timely one. And we've been also engaged with this for a fairly long time now. And I'm determined that I think by the way we are seeing things evolve, I'm very hopeful of, we actually reimagining a better future for our cities going forward. I'll stop here. Thank you.
Thank you, Kunalji. And it's really a very nice presentation, and you have provided the real platform. In fact, the idea of this webinar is of that dialogue where what civil society and entire city can do for the migrants. It is not only government responsibility to do it. We all failed and they were invisible to all quarters of the society, not only government policy or the programs, and things are happening. So may I move to the next speaker? And very nice to know from you that you have developed that idea of labor trust. Now, before I move to Professor Priya Deshingkar, 1 or 2 points I want to stress. All the participants may put their questions in the question and answers box and not under the chat. So kindly put forward your questions, because we are going to have 3 rounds. Every speaker will put forward in first 5 to 7 minutes. So all the 6 panelists will put forward their views. And by that time, I will collect whatever questions are coming up from you. Kindly don't have comments, but real questions in question box, question and answer box. So I will read them. And in the second round, I'm going to put forward those questions to panelists. And in the third round, each panelist will again summarize the takeaways. Now coming to the Priya Deshingkar madam, she, as you must have seen at the website and all that, she's a professor for migration and development. And she has done extensive research regarding the migration, poverty. And in that context, before Professor Deshingkar, you begin, I have a question. What way COVID pandemic has impacted migrant workers in other developing countries? We would like to have that global perspective from you, because Indian situation, everybody is knowing, he has going through it, has heard about. Has pandemic caused large scale reverse migration in other cities the way it happened, the phenomena which happened in India? Do migrant workers face similar kind of problems in the cities of other countries? I'm sure they must be facing same, but what are the workable, if not the best practices or initiatives which Indian cities can adopt to improve living conditions for migrants? Professor Deshingkar, I'm very pleased to welcome you. Kindly provide us the global perspective and your views.
Of course, thank you very much. I'm very, very happy to be part of this webinar. I do have a slide on the approach of other countries, so I will come to that question. I'll just give you a kind of brief overview of some other issues I wanted to raise today as well. So I'm going to share my screen now. Hopefully you'll be able to see it soon. Gosh, where's it gone? Yeah. Can you see it?
Yes.
Okay, so I hope that the moving forward of slides will also work. Let me just see, yes. Right, so in the first slide, can you see it well?
Yes, it's working well. Please go ahead.
Okay, I will need to change this view of speakers slightly so that I can see all the content of the slide. So I want to start with just a brief overview of how migrants relate to the city. And as you've heard in the news recently, short-term migration to urban and peri-urban locations is because people want to take up work quite often. You know, that is one of the primary reasons for people migrating on a short-term basis. And they come to work in industries and services, for example, in construction, in the textile industry, as street vendors, rickshaw pullers, and domestic workers, which is a huge sector for the employment of women. And there are many, many other subsectors that employ poorer migrant workers. And my focus in my talk today is going to be the less privileged migrants in our cities, people who are experiencing social exclusion and economic exclusion and political exclusion. And this became very evident recently during the COVID crisis. So poorer migrants tend to live on the margins of the city. And I mean physically, spatially, as well as socially. So they occupy informal settlements. They may live on site. So for example, in construction projects, and quite often they are even pushed to peri-urban locations or locations completely outside the formal boundaries of the city. And this is something we do need to consider in our discussions. So they may be put up in tenements which are actually in villages surrounding the city. But in effect, they are actually part of the city because they're working there. You know, that's what they're relating to. Now, the flows of short-term migration and circular migration in India are dominated by the lower castes and other historically disadvantaged groups. And there's been plenty of research on that, including my own. And this is quite an important point to bear in mind because this kind of social inequality is what actually determines whether or not they can access welfare programs and the benefits in cities. Now, many migrants don't have citizenship rights because they lack identity documents. And I've seen reports from well-respected NGOs recently saying that, up to 80% of them were found to lack documents by which they could access welfare schemes or register for schemes under labor laws. And this is a particular problem in these outlying tenements that I was referring to a moment ago. They also don't have documents which can establish them as legal residents of the city. So most of these migrants work in the informal sector. I mean, you've probably seen the figure that 90% of our workforce is in the informal sector. They don't have proper contracts. They don't have a security and stability in their job situation. So they can be hired and fired at will. And in fact, this is what we saw. The moment the economy was shut down, these people were left without jobs. And not only that, some of them were not paid their wages, their arrears in wages. So they suffered from enormous insecurity and precarity. And they're unable to access programs because they're linked to their domicile status as well. So they may possess ration cards, for example, that only say they're a rural resident, but they can't use that to access welfare programs in the city. I mean, I know that there are plans now to make this more portable, but this is the situation as it has been up to now. So I'll go on to the next slide. So what is the problem? Migration or exclusionary policies? I mean, I was very heartened to hear from Mr. Kumar that, migrants are being put at the center of thinking now. But I think up to now, there has been this issue of seeing poor migrants as a burden in urban areas. They're often regarded as a problem. And even now, that's quite often reflected in the language that I hear from urban planners and other people who are working to actually make cities more inclusive, ironically. And as I said, they're often pushed beyond the limits of the city, living in insecure tenements in neighboring rural areas, as we see in the case of Delhi. There are huge settlements there outside the limits of the city. Now, there seems to be a lack of trust somewhere where urban authorities fear giving them services or housing. And I've heard this repeatedly because they think that this will attract more migrants, or worse, foreigners, because they might just slip in under the guise of being internal migrants. And this could exacerbate the problem. So there is a lack of trust somewhere, which makes it very difficult for people to actually establish that they're legitimately there. There is very little recognition of their contribution to the economy. I mean, I've been trying to actually push that point through for the last decade or so. where I've said that, they're not just using urban services, they're also making a huge contribution. There is a bit more recognition of that now, but not as much as they deserve. So their cheap labor is used in industry and services, including big giants, in the whole commercial sector, because at the lowest level, the jobs are still informal. So these may be industries that are completely in the formal sector, but actually at the lowest level, their workers may be these excluded migrants who are circulating between rural areas and urban areas. So I found over the years that hidden in many policies, there are direct and indirect ways of keeping people in rural areas and away from the cities. So there was an overall kind of negative anti-migration climate in which migration was happening, and I think earlier, even MGNREGA had somewhere mentioned that stopping migration to the cities was an objective, and I believe that there are other policies like that as well. So what I'm saying is that the overall picture is loaded against migrants. And urban plans typically don't address migrant needs enough. And often technical objectives and fixes are privileged over understanding the structural constraints faced by the poorer migrants. So, in these documents on how cities are going to be modernized or beautified or made, into modern and smart cities, there isn't a great deal of discussion on the social and political and economic factors that keep poorer people in positions of exclusion. So that then makes me ask the question, well, whose city is it? I mean, if you look at some of the bigger metropolises in India, the proportion of people who live outside the formal built-up city it may be larger than the people, the proportion of people who live in slums or informal settlements. For example, the last census put the proportion of the Mumbai population living in slums at 42%. But this figure has been questioned by others like UN Habitat, who actually put the slum proportion at 3 times higher in India, not specifically for Mumbai necessarily. And also the census didn't necessarily count smaller shanties and informal settlements, of which there are many. Migrants don't just live in the larger slums, they're scattered all over the city, sometimes even sleeping in the open. So, if you look at it that way, then our cities are actually predominantly informal in many ways, and we need to think about them as the city, not just the sort of built up main portion. Now, gathering better data on this needs to be seen as a human rights issue, and the data has been very poor up to now, and this has become very evident during the lockdown. In fact, certain state governments were expressing surprise when they saw so many migrants suddenly emerging on the streets and being stranded, because many of them didn't even have the idea of, they didn't know how many migrants there were. And there was a scramble around for data. Even the Labor Department couldn't provide data when asked for it. So clearly there is a need for better data, and it's actually connected very closely to the rights of migrants, because unless you know how many there are, you can't make effective plans for them. And the negative position or stance against migrants is and the unwillingness to improve data. And I say unwillingness because there isn't really a great deal of political commitment to improving the data on the poorer citizens in cities. And I believe that this is wrapped up, unfortunately, with discrimination based on caste and ethnicity, because so many of our circulating laborers are made up of the scheduled castes and scheduled tribes and other disadvantaged groups. Now, this is something that needs to be talked about in a much more clear and open way. Because, you know, let's take access to rented housing, for example. It's very difficult for people belonging to certain communities to rent a room in a middle class location. So this is one of the reasons that they are physically marginalized in the city. So these are the factors that we need to talk about as well. And I believe that it's time now, given this crisis, to reverse this neglect and the negativity that migrants have suffered from for so long, and to make our cities more inclusive. So I'm really happy that we're having this discussion today. And I'm very, very pleased that Mr. Kumar said that all of us are invited to contribute and work together with government on you know, some of these challenges. And I will certainly be taking up that opportunity, and I hope the rest of you will as well. So now touching on the examples from other countries, I could see Dr. Joshi was getting worried that I wasn't going to get there. So I'm just going to give you a few examples. So I've worked very closely with research partners and government organizations in Ghana, which is a country in West Africa. They also have a lot of internal migration there, particularly from the poorer northern parts of the country to the cities in the south, like the capital city of Accra and other, you know, urban sort of developing locations. Now, they launched a national migration policy a few years ago. This is a dedicated policy on migration to ensure coherence across ministries, social protection programs for migrants in urban areas, improving data on migration, and more funding for municipalities so that they can manage migration better. So this point about ensuring coherence across ministries is very important, because hidden in many of the directives of different ministries, say rural development, urban development, all kinds of different ministries, there is often content related to migration, and that may be quite diverse. You know, it may be going in different directions. So I feel that even India should consider doing that to ensure coherence across different ministries. I know that there are some programs for social protection for migrants, but that needs to be stepped up. And again, that is linked to the whole data and numbers issue. There are many, many more circular migrants than had previously been imagined. So we need to do more to offer them social protection, especially at times like this, you know, when they have been left with nothing, no sources of support. Then improving data on migration, I've already made the point, but allocating more funding for municipalities is also important, specifically for migration. Now, I think that's where, you know, I find the Ghanaian example very instructive. So now let's turn to China. Now, China has considered housing, you know, social housing for migrants by looking at reduced rents for underutilized properties or vacant properties. And I'm not sure that this has been considered in India. I mean, we just heard that the rental market is being thought about, and, you know, it depends so much on market forces. So actually enforcing lower rents would be politically very difficult. But maybe this is a role for government in the interest of equity, you know, asking landlords or property owners to agree to reduce rents or make it mandatory for certain social causes. But it's an area that needs to be thought about, I think, more carefully. Also, China had a number of national surveys specifically on migration. Now, in India, we rely very heavily on the NSS and census data. Now, both of these surveys are not specifically on migration. And I know from the experience of, you know, running a very large international research program on migration, that there's a huge difference between specifically you know, design surveys that are that have much more detail in them to understand the drivers and patterns of migration and how, you know, where they live, what they're doing, and so on. And I really do feel that there is a need for a specific migration survey in India as well. Vietnam too had specific migration surveys. I mean, the most well-known one is the intercensal survey, which they, which they implemented in 2004. In fact, I was involved in analyzing that data, and it offered very useful insights onto their migration patterns. So I would once again recommend that. They also had, they're part of the, you know, the living standard surveys that the World Bank implements. And I know that historically some of those surveys were implemented in India, I think in UP and Bihar perhaps, but you know, it's something that could be considered because they do have very detailed modules on migration as well. So that's all I'll say at this stage about other countries. I mean, there are many other countries. I did mention, Dr. Joshi, in an earlier discussion with you, the example of Ethiopia as well, which I could mention again, where, you know, just before the lockdown happened, I understand that the government actually tried to identify people in Addis Ababa who would be vulnerable because they would lose their jobs. So they took preemptive action, you know, to try and identify vulnerable people and to make sure that they wouldn't be adversely affected. And they asked people to leave the city. So this is something, again, an example that I feel that we could learn from. So very briefly, ways forward. First, I think we should improve data, but as I've said before in other places, you know, we should do this collectively. So there's a role for civil society organizations and poorer residents of the city as well to conduct participatory mapping. And this has been done in a number of slums, but there is scope for doing more of that. It can also be backed up with satellite mapping, which has been tried in other countries. I'm not sure to what extent it's been tried in India. And I believe that we need to undertake a serious assessment of housing as it exists in the city and consider options for using vacant buildings and underutilized facilities. Also underutilized land. You know, there may be land that's just being held vacant, and, you know, government could then enter into discussions with the private sector on that. And on migrant identity, I think this is actually the crux of the problem, and we need to find implementable ways of establishing migrant identity. And that's where the real difficulty arises, because migrants don't have documents. They're, you know, they find it difficult to prove who they are and that they deserve benefits under programs. So here again, collaboration with civil society organizations like Aajeevika Bureau or Aide Action is so critical, because they are the people who work closely with migrants. And also collaboration with migrants' own associations or self-help groups, you know, so there is a need to involve others in establishing people's identity and need. And finally, we need to change negative attitudes and ideologies about rural-urban migration in particular, away from seeing it purely in negative terms, you know, as distress migration with people coming into the city and exacerbating problems of crime and filth and disease. There's so much more to migration than that, and migrants are a huge asset to our country, as we're discovering now. So I'd like to end with that. Thank you very much for listening to me, and I'll stop sharing my screen now.
Thank you, Professor. Now I would move to the co-founder of the Aajeevika Bureau, Rajiv Khandelwal ji. In fact, I must admit that the idea of this webinar is based on very recent Aajeevika Bureau report, and its title is also almost same, Unlocking the Urban, Reimagining Migrant Lives in Cities Post-COVID-19. So the webinar idea credit goes to the Rajiv Khandelwal ji's Aajeevika Bureau and its report, which was brought out in May 2020. Rajiv ji, we would like to know what are the issues this report has identified with regarding the living conditions or the hardship experienced by the migrant workers in the cities. And in that context, what ULB should do or other government organizations should do and all of us should do to improve living condition of the migrant workers in post-COVID-19 period. Also, I would request all the panelists, because somebody, one of us will be speaking. Now, lot of question and answers have started coming. Lot of questions have started coming. So I will request all the panelists to visit the question box and kindly answer whatever questions you can answer so that the participants will get answer to their questions. Rajuji, please go ahead.
Thank you so much, Ravikant ji, and thank you for this opportunity. I'm sorry I will remain invisible because of low bandwidth, and but I'm very grateful for you to consider, join, kind of continuing this discussion that we began in May. Certainly, a lot of issues are not new. They were, in fact, they are all pre-existing conditions which have got amplified during COVID times, and and lockdown especially has put at the very center of our, I think, consciousness, the exclusion and the denial that migrant workers face in our cities. I have to, Priya has actually summarized it so elegantly that it is hard to add to what she has already, uh, provided evidence for and what she's argued for. And I can only add to that. The reality is that the large-scale exodus from our cities of migrants, including of those migrants who lived in these cities for years and years, even if it was temporarily, it is owed to their sheer informality and sheer marginalization in the city kind of space, in the city imagination. And I think to it would be all too easy, and I keep saying this, that it'll be all too easy for things to return to business as usual. The lockdown will ease out, things will become more normal. Already from where I am, which is southern Rajasthan, a small trickle of people have already started to go back to Gujarat and to Surat, to not only conditions that were as bad but even worse, because it is a lockdown period. And so we must act swiftly. It is not just about nuancing the problem with more evidence, but also taking swifter action to make sure that people have a better kind of normal to return to, and not just the same old story. Now, what are the few ingredients of that? What did the study suggest? We looked at, based on our own work in Ahmedabad and Surat, we tried to understand how does migrant workers' experience intersect with urban governance. What ought to change there? What is the problem with urban governance that creates lower suboptimal kind of outcomes for migrants in cities? And there are a few things that I would like to emphasize, more by way of propositions rather than nuancing the problem itself, which I think Priya has done really, really well. The very first thing I think we have to kind of turn to is to legitimize, if not legitimize, at least start mapping and identifying spaces that migrants occupy in our cities. These are not just slums which have been mapped and and been geotagged, but these are locations that are home to thousands of people who are at work, but not in formal settlements. They are part of the more degenerated kind of peripheries of the cities. They may be open spaces in pavements, in parks. They could be informal settlements that have come up mainly to provide very squalid kind of shelter and provisioning in industrial areas to migrants. Now, most urban plans, including the cities that we looked at, did not even know that these spaces exist, right? And I think going forward, at least mapping these spaces, not with the view to beautify them or clean them up or to evacuate people out of them, but to start looking them as sites of potential service provision, and that these are locations that add hugely to the city and urban economy. Okay, so I think that mapping itself has to be a starting point. and and understanding that these are not, these will not be done away with anytime soon. So can we start looking at providing essential services in these locations that include housing, include sanitation, include transportation, which is very critical to workers who are in cities for work. We understood over and over again that the housing question is a very moot one, is a very central one. And the reality that most migrants in our cities are not permanent settlers. They are people who will go back to their villages. They are not claiming permanent and permanent ownership of houses in cities. And that creates a new paradigm of ownership, of use, of shelter use by migrants. So we have to really innovate swiftly in the whole area of rental housing, of social housing, which is possible to be offered to migrants at at a price point that they can afford, that does not offer poor and or spaces that are not, that don't have dignified kind of conditions, but respectable conditions for India's workforce to be living and occupying. But these are people who are there seasonally, will go back to their villages finally. We're keeping that in mind. That is the housing kind of option that migrant workers in our cities are seeking. The third area, which probably gets talked about a bit less than others, is the area of access to justice. Most migrants and the terms of their engagement and employment in cities lend them to serious exploitation at workplace by their labor agents, their intermediaries and employers. And because of the informal nature of their relationship in labor markets, it is very difficult for them to enforce any rights. It is very difficult for them to invoke laws that may be there in letter, but are not possible to kind of implement through a machinery which is sensitive, which is able to operate in the face of informality. Most legal services or legal response is based on documentation, which migrants do not have in cities, right? We believe that the experience of migrants in our urban areas would be significantly improved if they had swifter access to justice, including for reclaiming their wages, including for forced work, for physical abuse, and for denial of essential services by authorities or by their employers. It is the absence of that that creates or even aggravates informality in the lives of migrants, especially in cities. And our own experience of running a labor helpline shows that once there is security on that front, on the fact that you can access justice, I think their confidence and their ability to survive, shocks and exploitative conditions actually really improves significantly. Yeah. In many ways, I do think that the urban governance question for migrants is very centrally linked to the way our economy is shaped around informality, and that Priya has already talked about. It is unless that we correct the informality question, the issue that the largest number of people in our workforce remain informal, which means they have no documentation, they have no they have no way to prove their employer relationship, they have no social security, they have very little access. Unless those things are fixed, their relationship with the city will also remain informal. And we will see more of this happen, not less. And that informality issue cannot be fixed just by the urban governance providers. It has to be fixed by the labor administration, by a broader intent of labor administration and employers to start moving to a template of formality from informality. And I think we must consider the intersection of labor rights and urban services to be the point at which the migrants will be served better. And lastly, and I'll stop there, Ravi, I think this whole issue of domicile being the restrictive kind of barrier has to go. We have to argue for universal access. Domicile-based restrictions are untenable in an economy where millions of people move and they contribute. They're not just moving for entertainment or they're moving for contributing significantly to economy. domicile-based restrictions do not make sense. So universal access to PDS, to healthcare, to nutrition, to education is but the only way that we can, offer at least, some relief. Remember that our wages are amongst the lowest in the world. At kind of wages that we pay our workers, there is no way that services can be purchased at market pound prices. They have to be socially provided, and they cannot be restrictive barriers to provision of these services to migrants in cities. I'll stop there, and thank you very much for giving me this opportunity.
Thanks, Rajivji. Uh, I will now turn to Mr. Umi Daniel. Mr. Daniel, you and your organization Aide Action has been at the forefront in strategizing policy interventions for migrant workers in state of Odisha and Kerala and Maharashtra, which include interstate policy intervention, implementing creative solutions, and advocating for basic rights and welfare-based initiative for seasonal migrant. So we would like to know your views about how city administration and other agencies should work to address issues faced by migrant workers, especially in terms of education of the children and also the gender issues. And we would like to learn from the experience you have in your work.
Thank you, Ravikant Ji. Am I audible? I think.
Yes, you are.
Yeah, thank you very much. Thank you, INHAF, and Priya and Rajiv has already spoken a lot. I think around they've given a wonderful kind of background. And what I will do, actually, when we look at the informality has been spoken, and the number that we always wonder, like what's the number of people who are actually coming to our cities and where they are. Now so very small, the numbers are trickling now, and these numbers are available both at source and destination now. And after the COVID, I think when we saw that what happened after 25th of March, and the large number of people have moved back, government started looking at the numbers and where the number they will get. And that is how the people have been in focus in India. The children are actually quite visible. The flights of people are visible. And then we started talking about last 3 months was actually hectic in India, that we are talking about migrant. That's a good thing. And this, like Rajiv said, that there are structural issues are there. These issues have been there for long. And I remember when the Interstate Migrant Workers Act was actually formulated, and the Odisha was the state which actually contributed for this formulating this act in 1975. That time, Odisha must have seen that, okay, these issues are mostly kind of common, and the way the migrants are being exploited and taken to other cities and all. And they wanted to have an act to regulate, to monitor, to help the migrant workers, to have some kind of their rights are protected. But yes, after 1975, the same act has been made as an umbrella act for India. It's a national act, so that migrants' rights are protected. They are actually registered somewhere. Some numbers you can have. So when we are talking about migrant workers, interstate migrant worker, intrastate migrant worker, and the number which has come up after the when the government has declared. Now the government has declared around 67 lakh migrants have gone back to around 116 districts of India. And these districts are in 6 states, which are Uttar Pradesh, Bihar, Rajasthan, Orissa, Madhya Pradesh, Jharkhand, and these are the states. And then another information that which the Honorable Finance Minister has said, some 8 crore migrant, the plans were prepared, like the food security would be provided to them for next 2 months when they are back in their villages. And then I think it's being extended by the Honorable Prime Minister, the program for food security, the 5 kilo of rice and dal has been extended. And that is what we found. And then we have something to say, like, Narega is there. So, now the cities are not talking much about this migrant, because migrants have gone back to their villages. Now the receiving states, are actually like grappling with the issues confronting the migrant worker, the women, the children who have come back tired, like back to their villages. They have to be quarantined, they have to be provided food, they have to provided employment, and then we don't know when they are going to be back again to the cities. So that is where I think I will say. So what is the smart city? I think I was hearing, I think the smart city is a concept has emerged, but what is lacking in the smart city is the caring. I would say the smart city should also be caring city. Unless and until you see that how you treat your poor people, how you treat your migrant. So and the whole world it works that how the migrant worker have been treated in our cities. I think that's the confidence that poor people have lost some kind of, and we have interacted with many such workers who came back to Orissa, came back to Jharkhand, Chhattisgarh. We have been working with the people back. So that's what. Then second issue that I would say, the first issue, let me tell you that there is a source, there is a village, and these villages are actually like people have actually come to cities. And we need to understand that also. The people are back to cities not only because economic opportunities which the city is providing, but also to escape from the hunger, to escape from the conflict, to escape from the natural disaster and environmental degradation which are happening. So this is how the people have taken refuge in the cities, and this is like in a migration for survival. What Priya has said, and it is all about inclusion. It is all about citizenship rights, which is already my previous speaker have said. And the migrant mean not only the male, and the migrant mean a family, a infant, a children, adults and older, a disabled person, or an elderly. So when they go back to city, when they land up in a city, and they actually live in an informal settlement, or the construction worker, they live at a place that is provided by the companies, or a bricklin where large number of women, children, adults, and they live there for 6 months. So they continue to be invisible. I think that is the invisibilization has happened to the migrant worker. And as already this has been spoken, the lack formal residence rights, lack of identity proof, lack of political representation, low pay, insecure, hazardous kind of working condition, limited access to kind of state provided services, and many things. That means I think that many of these migrants in cities are not as living as like a citizens. And that I think we need to understand. And for the locals, it is like a big elephant in the room. I think that is what I will say. And the local bodies has limited kind of idea, limited information to reach out to the people. One, like what happened in Orissa, I need to say that when the people are coming back to the panchayats, uh, for the first time, the government of Orissa has actually given the collector or the magisterial power to the sarpanch, so that they could able to deal all these migrants who are coming up, and have certain power to actually help people create some facilities and also implement certain program. That is what the decentralization power comes. But when people are going to the urban areas or in the municipal area, I think hardly our municipal corporations are having the power to the people, so that they could actually plan, they could actually reach out, they could connect all these migrant worker with the social protection policies, or any thing that they could able to do. I think that is where actually we need to see. Uh, and I know there are shelter, the job security and public security, all of things are there, but I'll come back to the work that we are doing. We have done a study in six cities like Delhi and Jaipur and Hyderabad, Chennai, Bhubaneswar, to know that what's happening to the migrant children who are actually accompanying their parents. And you'll surprise that I think migrant children, none of 80% children, they do not access education. More than 85% children, they don't access actually immunization, ICDS. And when we see that an ICDS center is just a walking distance, just a nearby where people are living, but the services doesn't reach. And that is how we have done a mapping now in Chennai, in Tamil Nadu, to understand what's happening to the children. And a lot of people have come to Chennai, they're working in different sectors, and the same situation in which the children, the adolescent, and the people are working. We found more than 40% children were working in work sites like bricklines and all. What Kerala has done, Kerala said all the migrant workers are the guest workers. And that is how many of the cities have actually, they said, look, how we are going to treat the migrant worker and how we can connect with them, all the facilities that anyone is enjoying in the city, and that should be provided. And when we say that the children who are actually staying with the parents, or the children who are staying on the streets or on the places, like people have already said, like, no. So we have not done mapping of all these people where they are actually living and how they are being connected. For this to happen, I think Orissa and Andhra Pradesh, I think in the past, the labor secretaries have actually signed an MOU between two states to work for their migrants who are going to Andhra Pradesh, and what are the things that they could do both at source and destination for the circular migrants. Because circular migrants are not going to stay in the village, in the cities, they will be coming back. But yes, a considerable time they're going to spend at the cities, and how the city is going to connect them with the kind of facilities they want. Now, I will not take much time because many of these issues have already spoken out. I would actually touch upon some of the issues which are actually flagged up. One is when we see the pandemic, National Disaster Management Act, I don't see anything has been written about migrant because it's so old. 1897, this act was there, and it was actually again amended in 2020 April. But nowhere we could actually see that, okay, there are migrants, and because of this entire pandemic which will happen, the migrant needs a separate kind of thing. And second, we are talking about the entire portability issue. Government have already declared it, the One Nation, One Ration card since last year, but they haven't implemented yet. But we were looking at how this is going to be implemented. Housing has been already spoken about, or the temporary shelter. Labor laws are going to be the major kind of issues which are there, and because we all know how labor laws were actually, many of the state government, they started tinkering with, and also they made some amendment which will actually help the business. Now the issue is that, okay, the business and the people, or the capital and the labor, how we see that both and laborers, I think those who will be coming back needs much more than, I think, how the city could facilitate them for getting a better kind of job. Lastly, I would say the Interstate Migrant Workers Act, it is time now. It's time, and this act only talks about the male. It doesn't talk about female, it doesn't talk about children who are accompanying. So we need to have a comprehensive act which recognizes that migration is a fundamental right in India, and a lot of people are actually migrating, including children, women, and they need a decent kind of stay, decent work, where actually they would actually contribute to the economy. That is where actually we have been raising this issue, and we have also seen that the labor codes which have actually come up now, and the Interstate Migrant Workers Act has been discussed under the labor code, and we have also represented to the government saying that, okay, it is a time that we should actually protect the interest of migrant workers, and the labor codes are very important. And that is where I should stop, because many of these issues have already spoken. Thank you, Mr. Ravikant, and thank you very much.
Thank you, Mr. Daniel. Now I move towards to Ramanath Jha, sir. Jha, sir, in your illustrious career, you have worked at all levels, right from the Pandharpur Municipal Council to Solapur and Pune Municipal Corporation to MMRDA Metropolitan Commissioner and to the Urban Management Program of UN Habitat. You have seen changes in the urban India closely in your entire this career. In the light of various points put forward by earlier distinguished panelists, what need to happen at national, state, and city level for migrant workers? How you will synthesize all these different recommendations? Because I feel you are the person who can put that in a right perspective. Jha, sir.
Thank you, Mr. Joshi. I think you are expecting the moon out of me on such a difficult subject as migration. But despite its complexities, I would try and simplify the entire issue and try and strike at the fundamental problems that exist in relation to migrants and the cities. I would start with a general statement that cities fuel migration, and they substantially grow on the economic contribution that the migrants make in the cities. We know that the informal sector is very large, and it is formed of substantially by migrants, and therefore cities have a lot to owe in economic terms on the work that the migrants do. Big cities fuel big migration, and they grow big on the contribution of the migrants. So migrants are an economic asset. I happen to work in, as you said, all kinds of cities, and I found that as the city became larger, the percentage of the migratory force became larger. In Sholapur, it was around 20% where I worked. In Pune, it was 40%. In Mumbai, it should be close to 60%, although figures officially say it's only 42. And as Deshingkar madam very rightly said, those are suspect figures. So migration is good for economy. Cities will not survive without migrants because internally they do not have the ability to generate the kind of variety that is needed for the economic profile of the cities. In my understanding, the reverse migration that happened due to COVID was temporary. The migrants are going to substantially, overwhelmingly, I would say, come back to where they were working or in those states. And that's for the simple reason that the donor states who are sending migrants, they do not have the economic muscle to absorb the labor of all these people, and therefore they will go back to the recipient states where the economic profile is much stronger. There was mention of cities exploiting migrants. I think universally cities are exploitative and migrants do get exploited. But despite that, the migrants go to such cities and cities readily accept them. We have to see migrants in the larger context of the urban poor. The question is basically of the city not having been able to contend with urban poverty, which has been imposed in the form of people coming from outside. What are the kinds of problems that the migrants face? It would be difficult actually to say what are the problems they do not face, because when they come in, they're essentially facing problems of housing, they're facing problems of workspace, of physical infrastructure like water, sanitation, toilet, transport, social infrastructure like education, health. There are problems of wages. They work in many times on less than the minimum wages. Their working conditions, that is a problem because they work in hazardous conditions. So overall, while the city loves the migrants as an economic asset, it discards them as social outcasts as far as they being part of the city is concerned. And we have given this a good term, saying that the city informalizes the poor, including the migrants. If we are looking at solutions, the fundamental solution starts when we reimagine cities. It starts by cities being fair, just, equitable, and inclusive. Firstly, the city has to recognize that it has to do this. Now, how does it do this? It does this primarily by sharing its major asset, and that is land. If you're going to provide housing, you need land for that. If you're going to provide workspace, you're going to need land for that. So most of the issues that the migrants face and the urban poor face are related to the availability of land. And here, one must frankly say that it is not market which is going to provide most of these services to the poor. We have had experience of the last 70 years in which the market has not been able to provide a solution to the problems of urban poverty. And therefore the government has to step in and governments are owners of the largest chunk of lands in cities. So I think government will have to make a major change in putting governmental land as the first charge on urban poverty, for the needs of the urban poverty, apart from other infrastructural and other requirements that the cities have. So there has to be a recognition that while cities' economies have done well, the aspect of equity has not been adequately addressed by the governments. And I'm including in this all levels of government that need to work in terms of cities. Why is that not happened? Partly, I think, because of the preoccupation for many years of the government in dealing with rural poverty. So urban poverty was still something that was on the sidelines. It has now blown into a huge problem because of the larger proportion that it has acquired, which was not there earlier. There is also a lack of understanding in terms of the differences that lie between rural poverty and urban poverty, and the kinds of services that the urban poor need and the provision of those in cities. There's also some lack of sensitivity, and if these problems are to be solved, what should happen? Well, obviously the questions that would have to be addressed is how do we provide housing to the poor, both rental and permanent, and for that you would require land. You would have to provide livelihood spaces. We know that there are people who do their own small businesses, which requires land. We have a whole act that we passed of the Street Vendors Act, where it says that 2.5% of the population would form approximately the street vendor. But there would hardly be any city which has actually mainstreamed the provision of space for street vendors through its planning process. It has to, the migrants have to have adequate access to physical, social infrastructure, to public transport, and to all of the things that we mentioned right now. So how do we start this? This has to be started by the city doing a poverty audit and mainstreaming the results of that audit into the planning process that it does for the city and into the governance process. Now, one of the mistakes that we continuously make is to say that this is what the city should do. Unfortunately, our current situation is such that the cities are the weakest link of the governance architecture. One, they are completely dependent on states for their functions and for their finances. Individually, their finance is extremely fragile and they would not be able to bear the kind of load that the migrants bring in. So the states have to play a major role. And I would say that the problem is going to gain in proportion, and therefore the center cannot wish itself away, and it will have to come in large measure to support the migrant population and have a strategy that they should adopt, the state should adopt, and the city essentially would implement those strategies. So city planning, and when we talk of reimagining cities, we are essentially saying that we have to reimagine urban planning and governance, urban governance in the light of the requirements of the urban poor and of the urban migrants in the city. And unless that major change is made, the fundamental questions are addressed through the fundamental documents that the city prepares, so that the requirements of the migrants become a charge on all that the city does. The problem is much too large to be solved otherwise through mechanisms of market or through any other mechanism which is on the sidelines. Thank you. Over to you, Mr. Joshi.
Thank you. So I would ask panelists if they have gone through the question and answer, and if they have found some of the interesting question which need to be answered, then you can answer them live. Do you think any question? You must have gone to the question box. There are a lot of questions. If any panelist would like to answer them, because we are waiting for Surat Commissioner to join, but unfortunately I just spoke to him that his video conference with the Chief Minister of Gujarat is going on. So probably he will not be able to join. So I want to go into the second round of answering some of the important questions which participants have raised. I think meanwhile, other panelists look, some of the questions which I have seen, I would like to answer them. I'm not mentioning the participant, but I have looked at some of the questions. In fact, I have looked at all questions, but some of the questions I can answer. One question is asked about, should there be efforts to make the villages and the village economy sustainable, so that this migrant who have returned to the rural areas would get gainful employment, or their migration to the cities will stop? Yes, if you will see the first three measures which Government of India has taken actually were from that point of a view. They tried to increase Manrega budget by 40,000 crore. Also very recently, they announced a job guarantee scheme, that is the Garib Kalyan Rozgar Abhiyan of 50,000 crore for migrant workers in rural areas of the 6 states, from where the most of the migrants emanated and came to the cities. Also, there has been efforts to take them back. So these were from that idea. But as each and every panelist, and particularly Jha sir has very rightly pointed out, migration is must for the cities. And in context of urban, our Indian growth, our urbanization is not growing the way it should have, because our cities are not able to absorb our migrants. The rural poor has to get gainful employment and quality of life in the cities. And unless until that happens, the extra people who are working in the rural areas will not get the gainful opportunity to work. So we have to strike a balance between creating the enabling situations in the rural setup, whereby they can have gainful employment, livelihood over there. But at the same time, if these migrant workers don't return to the city, then cities will face the problem. In fact, still data is not available. When this entire episode started, government was not having data. Now it must have got data, but that data is not in public domain. The estimate shows that 1 crore, minimum 1 crore migrants have returned back to their homeland, and the maximum estimate is up to 3 crore. Now, migrants have started coming back. In fact, we are seeing some of the aberration that there are chartered flights being organized to bring the people back to the city. The question comes, where was this benevolence pre-COVID time or during the lockdown? So we need, and very rightly Kunal Kumar pointed out, that it is not only government responsibility. Yes, it has to take a lion's share and lead, because many pending issues are there over the decades about the migrant. We need a very comprehensive policy, as Priya ji has given example of Ghana. We do not have also a migration policy. As Rajiv ji or Daniel was saying, migration should be a fundamental right, because it is through the migration entire world has developed. If there will not be a migration, the civilization would not have developed. So another question which I have seen in the question box, many people have asked, is about the data and the migration support center. Yes, many experts, even the Aajeevika report has pointed out that there should be a one-stop all support center in the city. In fact, under NRLM, one form of a migration support center guideline was there. Funds were provided, but they didn't come into real way, and they were basically limited for providing gainful livelihood or employment to the skilled rural youth under the NRLM. So it has a limited focus. What we require, a very comprehensive migration support center in each city, which can take various issues of migrant, create the data, will synergize with the different department, because migrant issue is covered by different ministries and different department of government of India. So yes, we require that. Even Kunal Kumar put forward idea of city labor trust. In fact, I have shared a document with him about the migration support center on which we have worked. So that kind of a one initiative, and as Rajiv ji has rightly pointed out, there we have to move towards the universal basic access to the PDS system, or health or nutrition, education, which Daniel has pointed out, gender aspects. So I would request other panelists, if they have seen some of the questions and they would like to answer about those questions to the participants.
Joshi sir, I'll take up two questions. One that you have raised, and one I see Professor Menon has raised. And I'll take up Professor Menon's question first. He says that the scale of, good evening, Dr. Menon, anyway, first, and then I'll come to your question. You say the scale of re-reverse migration to the megacities will be limited mostly to construction workers, etc. What innovative employment generation options can be designed by host governments for returning migrant laborers who do not want to go back to the cities? The donor states actually have a lot of options if they want to do them. But as I said, they do not have the economic platform on which they can do this. If it is not the first time that they have realized that large numbers of people from their states have gone to Delhi, Mumbai, and other cities. This has been happening for quite some time, over decades. But probably the governments there thought that this is a good mechanism of sending people out and getting some money back into the state. So not much has been done in terms of laying the economic foundation on the basis of which they could have absorbed these laborers. And therefore, my hunch is that most of the people are going to go back from the cities that they have reverse migrated, for the simple reason that they will not be able to get the kind of jobs that they have got used to. And although wages were low where they worked, still they were able to earn much more than what the village profiles would provide them. So yes, the governments, the donor governments could do a number of things, but I don't think that they would be able to do those, for the simple reason that they do not have the platform as yet. It could develop in another 5 years, 10 years if they take it seriously, but not today. On the housing side, I think Joshi sir, you raised some of the issues in regard to that. This is a major thing that has not happened in cities. I have recently finished doing the Mumbai's development plan. And while I was doing it, it was quite clear that there are lots of pieces of land which could be allocated to providing affordable housing. And these could then, you formalize the poor by providing them proper housing. That has not happened. In a city like Mumbai, the entire population, half of the migrant and the urban poor, are living on around 8% of the land. And schemes that are currently going are further trying to constrict that land by taking away part of the land to go in for housing that would be on sale by providing free housing to the poor. So these are low quality housing. If you have to provide proper housing, then you have to get into affordable housing. The market will not get into affordable housing. The government will have to lead the process. And till government takes serious note of this, and I think the Prime Minister's Awas Yojana is a program in that direction, but it still has to succeed in the larger cities where the problem is acute. And we will have to watch and see how far it goes. It will not go far unless government commits its own land to affordable housing.
Any other panelist would like to respond to any question of the participants?
Yeah, I'd like to. Yeah, I'd like to.
Please go ahead.
Take up the question that about one nation, one ration card. This was a long-standing demand for portability, which actually society organizations were asking. But the one nation, one ration card, using the Aadhaar platforms and the POC machines and all, I think the long way to go. I think using technology that needs also database of migrants at both source and destination. Uh, and those who are migrating and those who are leaving behind, I think you need to consider whether the portability of PDS, how we are actually designing the PDS for both. Those people are actually the left behind and the migrant. So that is one issue is there. It has not been resolved, but yes, I think this will be implemented properly. If the access would be created, not only for PDS, but as we discussed about the nutrition, the food, ICDS, the midday meal, a lot of other like immunization, very comprehensive portability need to be thought about. I think in that case, this is a better. This is only the option available, but how it's going to be rolled out, that need to be seen. Second issue that rental housing issues have come up. I would like to know that I think Orissa, Bhubaneswar, I think is a not very big kind of city which will have also migrant labor. But Orissa was thinking about constructing rental housing. But the problem is the budget, the where you are going to get the budget. And they found out the BOCW budget for that. I think that is where actually the problem. The BOCW budget is for welfare of migrant workers or the other welfare, that you cannot divert that money for building, like diverting 300 crores for building houses and all. That actually we need to see, because BOCW, we have also spoken about how BOCW could actually help the migrant worker, because we have been discussing, because that is also not portable. Millions of workers are working in Gujarat or I can give a Surat from Orissa or in other places. So that money they don't get at the home state, because that's not portable. You are earning money in Mumbai, but when the person comes back, he doesn't get the benefit of BOCW, or where the person, the domicile thing we discussed, where the person is to be registered, whether the home state or at the working place, the entire issue of construction worker, the registering, it's like when they come back, so they don't actually claim those insurance and all. This remains at the destination point. Last point is actually the constitutional rights. Yes, it's a constitutional right for every citizen to move, but move with dignity. And also what we have seen, how they would actually go to the cities and find a better kind of work, a better kind of treatment, and the migration facilitation center is a good idea. But every district at the source area should also have a migration facilitation center, which could actually act as a bridge between both the migrant at the source and destination. Because now we have seen at least whatever Ravikant was saying, 2 crores, 3 crores, they still have a route. I think they've gone back to their places, because that connect is always used to be there. And the migration facilitation center at the source and destination should work. And you pointed out that the Government of India under NRLM has done. It's only for the DDU, GKY, the training people, it has not done, not expanded to other migrant workers. But I think it's a time that they need some kind of grievance redressal or some kind of center in each city where actually migrant could actually go back. I'll stop there. Yeah, over to you.
Thank you. Priyaji, would you like to come in?
I did want to respond to a couple of the questions. In fact, I'll respond first to the point about support centers in the city. And I think it's a very good idea. It's very important to have a support center, which is a one-stop shop. But what I would like to caution against is how it's implemented and who implements it. Because if it's a government-run outfit, knowing how scared undocumented migrants are in the city because of their status, it could be a problem. It could be a barrier for them to access, help of that kind. So it needs to be done in such a way that they feel that they are welcome, that they will be given support, and they're always looking for information. In fact, mobile phones are a very important source of information now for migrants all over the world. So I think, it's definitely important. I just wanted to highlight the sort of structure and implementation of it. There's another point about, I think somebody raised the point about Bhumi Putra, and how in Maharashtra there's been a call to local workers to take up the jobs that migrants were taking up. The idea that they could absorb more of their workforce by asking the locals to fill those jobs. And I think there we really need to be realistic about the sort of political economy of migrant labor in India and in many other developing countries, where employers actually prefer migrant workers. And there's a reason for that, because migrant workers are very easily controlled. They're often not unionized. They don't demand their rights. They're not so embedded in the local society and culture, so they cannot actually raise their voice against the employers. And this is actually time and time again something that emerges in academic studies of migrant labor. So it's a factor that needs to be borne in mind. Locals may well want those jobs, but we have to see whether the people who employ them are willing to give them those jobs. And I think there has been a pattern of preferring migrant workers. I mean, I have an unpublished study from Maharashtra which shows that, they will get workers from as far away as Bihar, and that there are very clear reasons for that, because these people can be controlled and exploited basically, so, and that you can't do so easily with local workers. And then finally, the point about rural development and, why not develop rural areas, offer people work in rural areas. I think Mr. Jha has already addressed that partially, but I just wanted to offer you another insight into that. I was recently part of another webinar organized by a university in Punjab, and they said that some of the panchayats in the locations that migrants are coming from, maybe in UP and Bihar, have actually set a ceiling on the wages, so they're like trying to control the wages. But of course, for migrants, that's not going to be very attractive, because they're used to a different level of earning. And, those locally available jobs may be a temporary relief measure, but in the long term, they won't hold them back. Their aspirations and their expectations are much different now because of the work they get through migration. So that's all I wanted to say.
Yeah. I have come across two good questions. One is about if these people, means migrant, are considering their native place or rural village as the home, and they look at the city only as a place to earn and an economic center, when they will think city as a home. I thought this is a very important question, and it has we have to reflect all civil society and at an individual level. See, they will see a city as a home if they get intertwined or they get integrated socially, politically, and culturally with the city. If that doesn't happen and city doesn't become a really inclusive city, accepting migrant in its cultural, social, and political fabric, the migrants will always consider a city as an economic center to earn the money, and will always continuously look at back to their rural village. But at the same time, human can have attachment to the different places. It is not like that it is exclusive his rural village or rural home to the city. No, if right kind of atmosphere is there, a man can have many kind of levels or his attachment. Another problem again I am seeing is about the migration. There has been a lot of, and Priyaji again can address, somebody is talking of a calibrated migrant, calibrated migration, how much city can absorb. I personally feel that migration should be left to the forces, and it's a very natural activity of a human being. Humans need to migrate. Of course, what we need to do that there may be exploitative conditions. So as a government, as a civil society, and those who are part of the city should take all those measures by which they don't get exploited. But who will decide the limit that how much people should come to the city? How to work out that limit? That is not possible. As I earlier said, there should be efforts to improve the village level infrastructure, opportunities for livelihood and all that. But as Ramnath sir has said, that it's very difficult. There is a huge difference between the wages. Yes, the wages are exploitative, but a Bihar migrant, whatever he earns in the Mumbai, he can't have it under the Narega or under the even this 50,000 crore Rozgar Hami Yojana. Those are temporary measures. So we need to drop all old ideas about the migration. Of course, expert on the migration is Priyaji. Priyaji, your take?
Yes, I think you've actually touched on a very important issue there, because you're right. You know, you often hear people talking about the limits in the city for migration, or limiting the numbers, or managing migration, you know. I mean, of course, there is an element that we have to manage, but migration is a part of the development process. And if you look at the global figures on migration, you know, there is this so-called migration hump, you know, which means a graph like that, where migration progressively increases with the levels of development, then it levels off, and eventually it will taper off. But India is, I think, still on the upward part of that curve. You know, we are developing rapidly. We are, you know, there's a lot of economic activity in certain parts of the country. So it's both a reflection of national development, but also regional inequality that's driving migration. And it's not something that we should see as an aberration. You know, we should see that as an integral part of development and something that will happen. So trying to stop it is, in my view, not very sensible. And I don't think any country that's tried to stop it, and that includes China, Vietnam, you know, Ethiopia, many countries have historically tried to limit mobility within their own country. It's not succeeded. You know, it's been an expensive failure. So we certainly don't want to be in that position. So I completely agree with the point you made.
I think we have already exceeded the time, and I would request panelists if they have anything to summarize, taking 1 or 2 minutes. So you may please summarize, and then we can close this. I know we are not in position to answer all the questions which participants have asked, but definitely rest assured that our email addresses are available to you through the INHAF, and the recording of this also will be available. So later on also, as Kunal Kumar has said, that you can send your queries to us individually on email address, or you can send it to INHAF, which can be sent us to us, and then it can be replied. So I would request panelists to sum up, and then we can end up this webinar. Daniel, what you want to say? Last few words.
Yeah, I see the entire issue which has happened now after the pandemic. Many governments, they're looking this as an opportunity to do something, whether it's a source or the destination. I think it's a time that is the right time that we are discussing all this issue. And we have seen that government started thinking little seriousness we could see about migration. It was not there earlier before the pandemic. I think it's an opportunity like how much people can do. And people also started thinking about whether how they will reduce distress migration. Okay, that is there with the hands of the source states, how they would actually plan, provide better kind of opportunity and give a choice to the people so that they could also migrate, and those who can stay back can also stay back, provided they are being provided better facilities at the source. I think I see this as also an opportunity to also address all these structural issues, may not be immediately, but on a longer term, based on the policies. And it's a good thing that, like, I heard Madhya Pradesh government has started setting up a migration commission now to look into. Some states are also thinking about bringing policy changes. I think it's a good beginning. Let's see. I think how this will actually move. Yeah, I'll say that much.
Rajiv ji, you have been silent. So what is your
I'm
take?
back.
I would like
I'm
to
so
summarize.
I'm so sorry. I missed the last 15 minutes. My network collapsed, but I'm back online. And if I seek your pardon if this point has already been made. I think there is a really strong case for industry and employers to get involved in provisioning of services. This is no longer just in the government's court. It cannot be just left to urban governance, to urban local bodies to fix. It has to now become a collective agenda, collective project, not just a CSR activity, mind you. It is not a CSR responsibility, optional responsibility kind of issue. I think it has to become a liability on the part of industry and employers to start providing what is essential, absolutely essential services to look at productivity of workers. We have chased low wages. I mean, we believe in cheapening of labor, whereas we should be really focusing on making labor more productive. And I think that's what should drive the agenda of industry and the economy, instead of this race to the bottom about having a competitive advantage because of our cheap labor and cheaply priced labor. I would say that.
Thank you. Absolutely beautiful point. Yes, they should be provided minimum facilities from the employers, which will improve the productivity. Priyaji, any short last word?
Okay, yes, just following on from the important point that Rajiv just made, I absolutely agree. We really need to stop this race to the bottom and cheapening of labor. But one of the things that makes us internationally competitive is that, so that's also something that needs to be addressed. I mean, if you look at the textile industry, typically it will shop around and go to the countries where labor is cheap, and again, if government wants to promote that kind of an export, then of course there will be a race to the bottom. So I feel that that's also something that needs to be thought about, is how migrants are part of these international value chains and what position government needs to take on that as well. So thank you very much.
Thank you. Jha sir, to
I
conclude and end this webinar.
Now, I will come back to the central role that the government has to play in terms of urban poverty. There is no getting away that while others help, poverty is something which has to be the central concern of government. Urban poverty is going to increase as urbanization increases, and the size of the urban poverty that will exist in this country over a period of time will get much larger. At the moment, it is more concentrated in the West and in the South. There are some states that are way behind in urbanization, but they are going to catch up. And you will find that we are not saying that government should do everything, of course not. But we are saying that it has to play the central role. It has to set the regulatory tone. It has to plan cities that will formalize the poor in living not informally, but formally. Now, these are things that have not happened because we have kept urban poverty as on the sidelines and not mainstreamed in our thinking. It's too large a question to be kept on the sidelines. Poverty audit has to be done, and the cities will have to devote more time, more resources, and more strategies to solving these problems. This will make the city more balanced. It will make the city economically vibrant. It will make them equitable, and it will make cities more productive. That role has to be played by the government.
Thank you. I take now liberty to end this webinar with the permission of all the panelists. And thank you very much. And thank you participants who have joined this webinar and have asked beautiful questions, and lot of interaction we could do, but not to the fullest extent possible. So I again thank INHAF for hosting this webinar, and distinguished panelists Priya ji, Daniel, Ramanath Jha, Kunal Kumar, Rajiv Khandelwal ji. I'm sorry that Surat Municipal Commissioner could not join, but if he would have joined, we could have got the city level actual perspective, but we have to dispense with because he is busy with the COVID fighting, and Surat is one of the very critically affected cities. Thank you all. And this registration will be available on the, this recording will be available on the INHAF website, and do join. My request to all participants, do join for the next webinar, whichever interests you. Thank you. Thank you all.
Thank you. Thank you very much.
Thank you.